Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kathleen Graham, the Executive Director of SABU, the leading association of business journalists. Thank you for being here with us this morning for our kickoff session, The Future of Pandemics and Preparedness, with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, the former FDA Commissioner. He serves on multiple boards, including Pfizer, and he's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. This session is produced through a grant to SABU from the Commonwealth Fund as a part of a larger program to help reporters on reporting on healthcare. Joining us today to moderate our discussion is Meg Tirrell. She is CNBC's senior health and science reporter. Meg, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Kathleen. And I'm super excited to get to be here to talk with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who, of course, we see often on CNBC. He's a contributor. He also sits on the boards of Pfizer and Illumina. And he's the author of a book that has now been, I don't know, Scott, what is it, 2 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, Uncontrolled Spread?
Actually, it hit once.
I thought it was 2 weeks on there, but you debuted right below Elvira, right? Number 5?
Yeah.
So pretty good. Scott, I want to ask everybody out there in the audience to submit questions. You can do that by posting them on the social wall, and we'll get to them and we'll try to sprinkle them in with Dr. Gottlieb throughout this conversation. We've got 45 minutes, so put them in early because I know there are lots of questions for him. Scott, let's start by looking at where we are in this pandemic. We're now starting to see cases, hospitalizations, and deaths all start to come down. Do you think we've reached this sort of peak of the Delta surge, or are we in kind of a dangerous position as we head into the winter?
Yeah, well, maybe we've reached the peak nationally, but this is going to be a highly regionalized wave of infection, like every other wave of infection. And the South has largely reached their Delta peak and are coming down very sharply. If you look at cases in the South, I mean, COVID's almost non-existent right now in Florida and Alabama, some of those states, it's way down, because they've largely let it run its course. I mean, people who haven't been vaccinated have been infected by Delta, and I wouldn't be surprised if the seroprevalence of the total exposure is 90% in a lot of parts of the South right now, in terms of people who have immunity either from prior infection or through vaccination. But Delta is now spreading to other parts of the country, and the national averages, when you look at sort of the national figures, you see cases coming down, even hospitalizations coming down, because it's being driven by sharp declines in populated states like Texas and Florida. But if you look at the Midwest and the West right now, the Plain states, there's pretty bad epidemics underway. 70, 80 cases per 100,000 people per day being diagnosed. To put that in perspective, Florida, its peak was at about 110, and Mississippi was maybe reached 120. So not nearly as bad as the South, but pretty bad. And then the question is going to be what happens in New England and the northern states. And I do think that we're going to see a pickup of infection in the north as the weather gets cold and people move indoors into confined spaces, oftentimes not with masks on, and you see spread. Those are the situations that are conducive to spread. So I think Delta is not done with us. I think we're, a good part of the way through this right now. Cases are starting to come down in the West and the Midwest. But I still think the Great Lakes region, New England are going to see an uptick in infections. It's possible the Northeast doesn't see a major upswing in infection because of high vaccination rates and high immunity from prior infection. New York City has about 77% of its population fully vaccinated, not just one shot, but fully vaccinated, which is of adults, which is pretty impressive. So, it's possible that there's not nearly as much of a wave up here in the north as there was in the South and the Midwest right now in the West, but I don't think Delta's done. By Thanksgiving, probably the virus will have run its course, maybe shortly thereafter over the whole country. And I think on the back end of that, we will see prevalence come down everywhere. I don't think that there is another surprise behind Delta. Most of the conventional wisdom is that if there's going to be new variants that emerge, it's likely to be within the Delta lineage. Delta is so contagious, it's crowding out other viruses, other forms of this virus, other mutations, and the variants that we're likely to see get a grip on us are going to be lineages of Delta that probably have partial escape from the immunity that we've acquired through vaccination and prior infection. But and that's a good reason why we may end up switching the vaccines over to a Delta backbone vaccine. But I don't think that that's going to be something that we really have to grapple with this sort of winter. It's maybe a 2022 phenomenon.
Wow. I mean, being through this peak potentially by Thanksgiving nationally, That's more optimistic than I was being. What are the risks to that? I guess you've warned, and so has the CDC and federal health officials, that we could be in for a really severe flu season whenever flu comes back. So we're being asked to go out and get our flu shots. We should get them before Halloween. Are there any signs that we're going to get flu this year yet?
Yeah, I mean, the risks to it are that the Delta wave extends out a little bit longer, that you see a very slow uptick in cases in the north and the northeast, and the sort of peak doesn't happen until sometime after Thanksgiving. We're just kind of in this longer. It doesn't run its course as quickly. But Delta's moved through other parts of the country fairly quickly. It's been sort of a 2-month cycle. In terms of flu, it's hard to tell right now. I talked to Caitlin Rivers and some others who look at this data very closely, and they think it's too early to tell how severe the flu season is going to be this year. Some indication it's probably not going to be a bad flu season. So we're going to have another mild flu season. Cases are down from where they are historically, but at the same time, vaccination rates are very low, and there's not a lot of immunity in the population from flu. And so there's a potential that it could race through the population much quicker than flu's moved through the population in the past. So too early to tell. I think there's some reason to think it's going to be another mild flu season, but we're very vulnerable to flu. When it does come back, it's going to come back with a vengeance. And if there's any kind of mismatch between the prevalent strain of flu that's circulating and what we've put in the vaccine, it's going to be really bad. And because there's not a lot of flu spreading globally, our ability to guess which strains are going to become most prevalent in the North America and get the vaccine right is somewhat diminished. So we're not as good at predicting what strain is going to become prevalent in the US, because we don't have a lot of virus circulating in South America and Australia, the two places that we typically look to try to figure out what the prevalent strain is going to be here in the Northeast, or the North and North America. So it is a bad setup. And at some point, we're due for a really bad flu season, precisely because we haven't had one.
The mRNA vaccine companies, of which you sit on one of the boards at Pfizer, are working on flu vaccines using mRNA technology. And that's exciting because we could potentially respond faster, start working on what goes into the flu vaccine later so that the strains can be better tailored in the vaccine. How close do you think seasonal flu mRNA vaccines are? And do you expect they're really going to change how we protect ourselves against seasonal flu?
Yeah, if we could pull it off with the mRNA technology, I think you could potentially have a much more effective vaccine. And remember, Pfizer had a program with BioNTech working on a flu vaccine that they pivoted into developing a COVID vaccine. That's why the company was able to move quickly into being able to create a COVID vaccine. One of the virtues of the mRNA process for flu vaccine is, as you know, Meg, the way we make the traditional flu vaccine is we basically grow up the virus in eggs, actually. So we harvest the virus out of cell cultures. The culture medium that we use is fertilized eggs. We inactivate the virus and we cleave off its surface proteins, and those proteins become the medium for the vaccine. They basically become what goes into the syringe. But there's two surface proteins that are immune dominant on the surface of the virus, HA and NA. And the typical vaccine only has one of those proteins in it because the other one isn't stable enough to be put into a syringe. It breaks down very easily, so you can't really stabilize it and get it into a vaccine. The mRNA approach, what you're doing with mRNA is, instead of injecting the protein directly into a person, you're injecting the small snippet of RNA that codes for production of the protein, and the person's basically arm becomes the factory for manufacturing the protein. So rather than manufacturing that protein in a chicken egg and injecting it directly into a person, you inject the sequence that codes for the protein into a person, and their arm becomes the chicken egg. It becomes the factory for growing the protein. But since you're not actually injecting the naked protein into a person with the mRNA approach, but instead you're injecting the genetic sequence, you can actually get both of those proteins into the vaccine, because you can put the sequence for the production of both of those proteins into the vaccine. And now all of a sudden you have a vaccine that, instead of inducing immunity against one of the surface proteins found on flu, you can induce immunity against both of them. And so you can potentially have a much more effective vaccine that covers a much wider range of flu variants. And that's the kind of promise behind the idea of using mRNA technology for flu in particular, and why it was so attractive to try to develop a flu vaccine using this technology. Now, the rub is that there is an upper limit to how much mRNA you can put in a person, because what causes the vaccine-related side effects, sore arms, fatigue, fever, isn't really the spike protein that the vaccine is inducing in the setting of COVID. It's the mRNA. mRNA itself is immunogenic. You develop a mild immune reaction to it. And that's actually probably what makes these vaccines effective, is that the mRNA is sort of upregulating the immune response at the same time that you're exposing the body to the COVID proteins. And so you're training the body to say there's something here that you should react to. And then what it ends up finding is the COVID proteins, and it reacts to that. So it's a long way of saying you can't put 200 micrograms of mRNA in someone. The Moderna vaccine is 100 micrograms. The Pfizer vaccine is 30 micrograms. There's an upper limit to how much you can put in, and we've probably reached it. Could you go to 40 with the Pfizer vaccine without inducing a lot more side effects? Yeah, you probably can. We tested a 40 microgram dose, so we know what it looks like. Moderna is probably at the upper limit with 100 micrograms of mRNA. So if you want to get what we call a multivalent vaccine, if you want to develop a vaccine that's protective against multiple different strains of flu, you're not going to be able to put 10 strains of flu in, because you can only put so much mRNA in a vaccine. So could you put 3 in? Could you have 10 micrograms of one strain, 10 micrograms of another, 10 micrograms of a third one? It's possible. It's possible that since we already have a lot of exposure to flu, it's not going to take 30 micrograms of mRNA to induce immunity against a single strain of flu, that you might get away with being able to use just 10 micrograms of mRNA, and then you can get 30 micrograms total in and induce immunity against 3 different strains of flu. But that's going to be the question. How many different valents can you get into an mRNA vaccine? How many different strains of flu can you inoculate against at one time using an mRNA approach? Is it just one, or could you do 2 or 3, 15 and 15, or 10, 10 and 10? And will that induce enough immunity against those different strains? Because we know with flu, you're going to need to have multiple strains in. Now, that said, the reason why we have quadrivalent vaccines for flu, the current flu vaccine protects against 4 different strains of flu, is because we have to guess so far in advance of the flu season what the prevalent strain is going to be, that we don't guess really well. And so to cover ourselves, we put 4 different strains in the vaccine. With the mRNA approach, you could probably manufacture the vaccine sort of just in time, much closer to the actual flu season. And the closer you get to the actual flu season, the more precise your guess is going to be about which strain ultimately becomes most prevalent. So if we can compress the time that it takes to actually identify the strain and put it into the vaccine and manufacture it at scale, which we could do with the mRNA approach, it could very well be that we don't need to put 4 strains in the vaccine, that maybe we can only put 1 in, because we're going to be so good at predicting what the prevalent strain of flu is.
So we know that Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech are starting these trials in people, I think this year. How far off is this future of mRNA seasonal flu vaccines, if it works? 5 years, do you think?
No, I think it's less than 5 years if it works. I mean, would it be ready for the 2022 flu season? Probably not. But I think it could be ready after that. I think you have the potential that it's ready a year after that. And the only reason I say probably not is I think FDA is going to be cautious with a seasonal flu vaccine, given how widely it's used. But the flip side of that is that the COVID vaccines have been used so widely at this point that we have an enormous safety database on mRNA-based vaccines, and we're going to have a multi-year safety database on literally hundreds of millions of people. So it could be that a flu development program moves fairly quickly, but I think the agency is going to want to see outcomes data to make sure that the new approach is protecting as well as the old approach. They're not going to want to just look at immunogenicity data, the ability of these vaccines to induce an antibody response. So to get really good outcomes data for a flu vaccine, you're going to have to run it during flu season. So, you could have the potential. I actually don't know how far along Moderna and even Pfizer's program is, I have to admit. So I don't know if you have the potential to run clinical studies in 2022 with a flu vaccine or not. But if you could have a candidate vaccine ready for sort of the fall of 2022, you can do clinical studies during the flu season and have data at the resolution.
Let's talk about your old agency, the FDA. They are meeting today and tomorrow to discuss booster shots for Moderna's vaccine and J&J's vaccine. Before I get into asking you about that, the FDA doesn't have a permanent commissioner right now. President Biden hasn't nominated somebody. Janet Woodcock, who's been with the agency forever, and of course, who you worked with when you were commissioner, is the acting commissioner. We understand there's sort of a deadline in November by which time an interim commissioner isn't supposed to stay in that position. I guess it's sort of like 8 months out from when the new president comes in. And it seems like they're getting close to naming a potential candidate. What do you make of what's happening at the FDA, why they haven't named somebody yet, and who do you think should be commissioner?
Well, I think they're going to name someone imminently. It might even be today. President Biden is giving some statements later today, presumably about COVID, but there's a potential they could announce a candidate. I think they have one. I think
Headline to the journalists out there. Wow. Okay, keep going, Scott.
I'm not going to comment on who I think it should be because I have some insight into it. I will say though, as far as Dr. Woodcock is concerned, I think the administration really, frankly, did the right thing leaving her in that role. I wish she could have been confirmed into the position. It's a shame that she was held up by some Senate Democrats. It's actually Democrats holding her up over issues that I don't think are really valid. I mean, the criticism of her around the opioid approvals, I don't think she bears blame for that. There were a lot of people a decade ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, actually going back, who got that wrong. I mean, I was at the agency for part of that history back in 2002 when I was there with Dr. McClellan. And this was when the opioid abuse problem was first beginning. And there were a lot of people who didn't recognize it and made decisions that, with hindsight, look like wrong decisions. And I don't think this falls on Janet Woodcock, and I don't think she should be held up for that. But as far as leaving her in that role for as long as they did, I think they did exactly the right thing. There's a very steep learning curve to that job, even if you know the agency. I had been at the agency twice before, worked for 3 different commissioners, and when I got into the FDA role, it's a steep learning curve. You're not going in there and operating day one extremely effectively. You have to build a team, you have to learn the agency, you have to learn the people. And so if you're in the middle of the biggest global public health crisis, maybe in the century, having someone in that position who is a very experienced hand who can operate day one and be highly effective, there's dividends to that. And that's what they had in putting Janet in that acting role. So I don't blame them for not being in a rush to move her out just so they can move someone else in who potentially, depending on who it's going to be, could have a learning curve to that job and not be able to hit the ground running day one in the setting of pressing public health crisis. And I think she's done a very good job in the acting role. I wish she could be confirmed into the position, but that doesn't seem like it's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I can't let that drop completely. I know you're not going to tell us who you've heard it could be, but can you give us any hints or at least your thoughts on whether the person is the right kind of fit for the job?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm not going to comment on it, but we'll see. I mean, I could be wrong, but we'll see who they end up putting in the job. But again, I think experience matters in that role. It's not a beginner's job. A lot of my criticism of Hahn in that role was that he knew nothing about FDA when he came into that job, and it showed. In the setting of, you never have an opportunity to make repeated mistakes in these kinds of jobs, and especially in the setting of a public health crisis like this, I don't think you can learn as you go. You got to come into that job knowing how the agency operates and how to function.
Well, so thinking about the role of the FDA through all of this, it's been confusing going through this whole booster process. And we've got these 2 days of meetings today and tomorrow. They're talking about Moderna's vaccine today. And from the documents that the agency posted this morning, they're asking their outside experts on vaccines to vote on whether a Moderna booster, a half dose of the booster, should be authorized for basically the same groups as the Pfizer vaccine, people over 65, and then people down to age 18 with either underlying health conditions or exposure risk because of their jobs or other settings. But they also have asked the experts to discuss whether mRNA vaccines, so both Moderna and Pfizer, should be cleared for the general population down to age 18. What do you make of that? It appears from the outside, the administration had that view that boosters should be available to essentially everybody 6 months out, but the advisors and some folks at the FDA didn't agree. So they narrowed it, but now it seems like they're trying to expand it again. Just tell us about your take on all of this.
Yeah, look, I think you saw the CDC decision reflect a certain degree of ambivalence about the benefits of boosters generally. And so the decision they made, sort of recommending it for anyone over the age of 65 or those who live in long-term care facilities, and then leaving it to discretion for those under the age of 65. But scoping in a pretty broad swath of the population. Anyone who's at excessive risk of COVID from occupational exposures, anyone who's at excessive risk of COVID because of pre-existing health conditions. I mean, that incorporates a lot of the population. And the direction from CDC to the pharmacies, I've been told, was implement a system that's frictionless to make it easy for people to self-qualify for boosters. They sort of effectively generalized the availability. I think they want to revisit that question, and I'm not surprised. They now have more data on the degradation and immune protection offered by vaccines generally. They have more data now on the efficacy offered by the boosters. It's, we're sort of 2 months, at least 6 weeks later in terms of the maturity of the data. So it's not unreasonable that they revisit the question. I think that what makes some of the public health folks uncomfortable, aside from, there's two questions I think that make some of the public health crowd uncomfortable. First is that there's still a belief that the vaccines are fulfilling their original premise, which was it was going to protect you from hospitalization, severe disease, and death. And so where you're seeing some degradation in the immune protection is around breakthrough infections and mild disease. But I don't think we can say anymore that the decline in immune protection. I think that this is vaccine-wide. I don't think this is just specific to one vaccine. Pfizer's collecting a very rich data set from Israel and was used earlier, so you're seeing it there first. But I think that this is just a phenomenon of inoculating against COVID. But we're now seeing people who were vaccinated a long interval ago, who are older and have more underlying health conditions, getting in trouble. So there's now a public health case to make that it's not just breakthrough infections happening, but actually there are more significant infections and hospitalizations happening among a cohort of the previously vaccinated. So I think that's part of the debate among the public health crowd. Why would we re-inoculate the population and use up scarce supply of vaccine just to kind of achieve a level of protection that wasn't what we were originally seeking with these vaccines in the first place? What we were really seeking with these vaccines was to reduce the incidence of hospitalization and death. And I think the other part of this is that, if you look at young men, 16 to 25, there is clearly a signal around myocarditis. And so given that they're healthy, given that they probably have a pretty robust immune response from the original vaccine and aren't seeing any decline in their immune protection, I mean, I think younger people are more likely to have persistent protection from vaccination. Why would we offer boosters to that population? And so if you end up offering boosters to anyone 18 and above, there's no way to carve out, young men 16 to 25 or young people 16 to 25 or wherever you think the signal around myocarditis is, but it's clearly among younger people, clearly more prevalent among men. So I think that's what also is creating some concerns. You could potentially write a label where you say, where you do carve them out, but I don't know that there's enough data to really draw those kinds of conclusions. CDC can make that kind of recommendation. I think FDA would be in a more challenging spot because their standard for writing labels is higher than CDC's standard for issuing recommendations. So I think that those are the two issues that are creating some of the tension around a broader general recommendation for boosters, even though that's effectively what we have with what CDC did, just with a lot of nuance wrapped around it.
Well, I want to remind the audience you can submit questions on the social wall for Dr. Gottlieb. Scott, you mentioned myocarditis risk for particularly young men. I'm wondering how you view the risk as we hopefully get the vaccine cleared for younger age groups down to age 5 and then even younger down to 6 months. The trials, we had to run them quickly. And we didn't run a 30,000 kid study. It's more like 3,000. So we would never pick up that risk given how prevalent it has been, how rare it has been in the older age groups. So I guess I just wonder, as a parent of a almost 3-year-old boy, should I be worried if when the vaccine gets cleared for him that there could be an increased myocarditis risk? How do we weigh these things?
Yeah, look, my twins are turning 12 really soon. I'm going to get them vaccinated when they turn 12. I think the risk reward makes sense. I think it's going to be liberating for them in many ways to be vaccinated. When my 8-year-old's eligible to be vaccinated, I'll vaccinate her as well. I still have confidence in the vaccine. In young kids, but you worry more about any vaccine in a young child who's not at risk, as great of a risk from the illness, You worry about any vaccine-related side effects. And, these vaccines aren't completely benign. They create an inflammatory response. Anything that induces a big inflammatory response, you put that in 100 million people, and some people are going to have untoward effects, not from a direct effect from the vaccine or even exposure to the spike protein, but from the inflammatory response. I mean, if you put something in a patient and it causes them to have a high fever and causes them to have a generalized inflammatory response, different people are going to manifest that in different ways. The vast majority will just have, mild symptoms, but there'll always be that small percentage that have get more stimulated from it and can have an untoward effect. And that's probably what the myocarditis is. If the myocarditis is related to the vaccine, and many people think it is, it's probably not some direct effect of the spike protein on the heart. It's probably just a manifestation of a generalized inflammatory response that the vaccine induces that's manifesting itself in a small number of patients as mostly self-limiting myocarditis and pericarditis. I mean, the data out of the New England Journal of Medicine study about 2 weeks ago, I think, was reassuring in terms of this being low incidence. I mean, they were getting like 10 cases per 100,000 in the highest prevalence group, young males, and the vast majority were self-limiting. With the vaccine for 5 to 11, Pfizer tested, and Pfizer's much further along on the pediatric vaccines than Moderna. It's just a statement of fact. I'm not trying to make a comparative statement. So it's going to be the Pfizer vaccine that's available for children probably for a long time. And I don't know how long. I actually don't have insight into Moderna's development process. I haven't just kept up to date on it. So the 5 to 11 vaccine that Pfizer developed, we actually tested 3 different doses. The company tested 3 different doses. They tested the 30 microgram dose, they tested the 20 microgram dose, and they tested the 10 microgram dose, which is one that's going to be available, hopefully, if everything goes well, at the FDA Advisory Committee. And the 30 microgram dose clearly was, more vaccine-related side effects, and the immune response was more than what you think is necessary. So the basis for comparison was people 16 to 25. So the company was saying, okay, people 16 to 25 when they're vaccinated develop this level of antibodies. Let's find the lowest dose possible for 5 to 11-year-olds that produce something comparable to this level of antibodies, but we'll try to get the lowest dose possible. And the 20 and 10 microgram dose actually produced comparable levels of antibodies. And so they both produced levels of antibodies that were fairly consistent with what you saw in the 16 to 25-year-olds. And so we picked the 10, because why not go with the lowest? If you can get the same level of antibody response with a 10 microgram dose, and you're not going to do much better with the 20 microgram dose, why go with the 20 microgram dose? So there was a real emphasis on trying to find the lowest dose possible to produce a comparable level of antibodies to the 16 to 25-year-olds. And that's how the company ended up with the 10. And then with the younger kids, the company tested even more doses, and that's how it ended up with a 3 microgram dose in kids ages 6 months to 4 years. And so if you believe that the vaccine-related side effects, the tolerability of the vaccine, and some of those immediate side effects we see, including the potential risk of pericarditis, is related to just the exposure to mRNA and the inflammatory response you get, then it's at least theoretically sound to think that the lower the dose you use of mRNA, the less likely you are to get those side effects. Now, that said, kids have very robust immune responses to vaccines. That's why we lower the dose of a lot of vaccines in kids. And so, they're more likely to have an overactive immune response to a vaccine. As far as the 3,000, you obviously have a much larger data set. And so you're looking at the data set in 12 to 18, which is now pretty large. I mean, tens of millions of people have been vaccinated above the age of 12. So that's informative. But a 3,000 patient clinical trial in kids ages 5 to 11 for an adult vaccine that you're moving down into kids, that's pretty typical. I mean, that's actually typically the kind of data set that FDA makes decisions on in the setting of vaccines. It's rare that you have the 30,000 patient trial just in children. Where you typically would have that is in a pediatric only vaccine. So like the rotavirus vaccine, which had a risk of intussusception associated with it. When Merck did that trial, they enrolled 70,000 kids. That was a child vaccine that had a known side effect that they wanted to characterize. And it was a vaccine that was going to be largely used ex-US. So there are instances where you do very big trials just in a pediatric population, but typically when you're walking an adult vaccine down into a pediatric population, and a 3,000 patient trial is what FDA makes decisions on. So there's nothing highly unusual with the data set that they have here, just that everyone's, obviously extremely focused on it.
Yeah, and Paul Offit, who I developed one of the rotavirus vaccines, wrote a great op-ed in the Philadelphia Inquirer, actually, just talking about that trade-off between the size of pediatric trials and the speed with which we need a vaccine. He brought it back to the polio vaccine and sort of the pain that Jonas Salk felt about having to run this massive trial before giving the vaccine that he was convinced worked to more children. When are we going to have a vaccine for kids down to 6 months? The timeline's pretty well spelled out for down to age 5, and the FDA meeting said we've seen the data should be early November, it sounds like. But we haven't seen the data yet for younger kids.
Yeah, so I commented on Face the Nation about this last weekend, and it didn't really get picked up. But I said that the timeline is going to get extended out for that. So, it looks like I was
not watching last Sunday. Now I'm regretting it. Extended.
So it looks like FDA. First of all, this is going to be discussed at the October 26th AdCom. So I think you're going to have a very clear indication coming out of that AdCom. But it looks to be the case that FDA is going to ask for more data on the 6 months to 2 years and 2 to 4, just like they did with 5 to 11. So if you remember, they extended those trials. They asked for larger trials, and they asked for a longer median follow-up. It looks like, based on discussions that Pfizer's had, that the same thing's going to happen with the vaccine for the younger kids, and that's going to push the ability to unblind that data probably into Q1 of 2022. So you're not going to have results from those trials probably to the first quarter of 2022. So it does push out the timeline. I think the old presumption was that Pfizer may have data on at least 2 to 4 before the end of the year. I think you had reported it sometime in November. I don't think that's going to be the case. Now, we'll know for sure coming out of the AdCom, because I think based on the feedback at that AdCom, FDA is going to make a final decision. But this is the way it seems to be trending right now.
I'm never not watching Face the Nation again.
It was interesting because I actually, I was pretty clear when I said it, and I knew what I was saying and had run the traps on it before I put it out there, and it didn't get picked up at all. Maybe I wasn't that clear.
All right, well, I'm tweeting as soon as I finish this, or if anybody watching this is tweeting it out. Parents are rapidly interested in when they will have a vaccine for young kids. When you say Q1, though, I mean, that's a span of 3 months. Are we talking January? Are we talking end of March?
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. It's going to be Q1, but it's hard to know until you get sort of final guidance from the FDA and you have a sense of just how many patients need to be enrolled. And then it's always, there's obviously variability because you don't know how quickly these trials are going to enroll. I think that they'll enroll fast, but they could enroll more slowly than the 5 to 11. As you move down the age continuum, it gets a little bit more difficult to enroll trials.
Very interesting. I want to ask you also, this is sort of a broad question. It applies to now, but it also, I think, applies to future pandemics. Hopefully, we'll be able to avoid them. And that's part of what our conversation should be about. But the role of industry in responding to a public health crisis. They've obviously developed these miraculous vaccines in record time. And there was, unprecedented cooperation from regulators, support for some companies, not Pfizer, except for the purchasing agreement, support for development for Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and others. And now criticisms that the companies are controlling the distribution of the vaccines. We really got some harsh words for Moderna yesterday from David Kessler, the chief scientific advisor on COVID to President Biden, who essentially said the company's not stepping up in terms of making the vaccine available equitably around the world. There's been criticisms of Pfizer too. How do you respond to that? And do you think that the situation should have been done differently in terms of ensuring access globally?
Well, look, I'll talk about Pfizer because I'm more familiar with what they're doing, and I think that the WHO is playing politics here, and they're pointing the fingers at the drug companies in the West because they're not doing what they should be doing, which is trying to get boots on the ground and infrastructure in place to actually distribute this vaccine. So it's very easy to say this is a supply problem, but this is going to very quickly become apparent to everyone that it's not a supply problem anymore. It's a distribution problem when we literally have doses, tens and maybe hundreds of millions of doses expiring, waiting to be used. And Pfizer's already seen tens of millions of doses go expired in some countries that it shipped vaccine to that couldn't get distributed in time to be used. Pfizer has said they've already committed, and they're going to make more available, but they're already committed to donating or giving away at cost to to the US for distribution, 2 billion doses of vaccine, which is an awful lot of vaccine. I mean, we've already distributed 6.5 billion doses of vaccine globally. The global population is only 7.5 billion people. You got multiple entrants in this. China's shipping vaccine everywhere. Russia is. You got AstraZeneca, J&J, Moderna, Pfizer. Novavax going to enter the market, and so will Sanofi. And Sanofi can produce an enormous amount of vaccine. We're going to have an enormous amount of vaccine coming into the market. So Pfizer's donated or given away 2 billion doses of vaccine and has partnered with what is probably arguably one of the best existing vaccine manufacturers in the African continent in South Africa to basically expand that facility, invest in that facility, expand it, and do production in that facility to get production into the African continent. This criticism that they should be giving away the IP to everyone. First of all, the only people who can really copy this are going to be Chinese manufacturers and Indian manufacturers, other than Western vaccine manufacturers, in any reasonable time frame, like any multi-year time frame. And it's going to take them longer to do it. Fosun is trying to manufacture the BioNTech vaccine and hasn't, and that's a full tech transfer. But BioNTech is working with Fosun in China to do it, and it hasn't happened yet. So, this idea that if you just give away the IP, everyone's going to be able to do it, it's harder than you think. And number two, Pfizer doesn't own the IP. Like Moderna and Pfizer don't own mRNA IP. The IP is all cross-licensed. A lot of it's actually owned by Japanese firms. There's going to be litigation and settlements for years to come about who owns which IP around mRNA. What Pfizer and Moderna have is the know-how on how to scale manufacturing of this. And that could be taught, but it's not something that can be taught in a month. And to give you sort of an indication, J&J and Merck have been working together in a full-on tech transfer for probably 8 months now. Meg, you know the timeline better than me. And Merck's still not making J&J vaccine. And this is the world's best vaccine manufacturer, Merck, in a full-on tech transfer with J&J, with J&J there teaching them how to make their vaccine, and they still don't have production up. So it's not easy to transfer this tech and build facilities to do this. If you're building new facilities, that's at least a 2-year effort. Even if you crash it, probably more like 3 years. But even if you take an existing facility like Pfizer did in South Africa, where there is an existing facility, and you move more technology in, and you go on site and do the full-on tech transfer, you're talking about in a good scenario, maybe you could do it in 6 or 8 months, and probably a little longer than that. So I don't know when people say we should just transfer the technology. Well, the IPs we don't really own. I mean, I'm sure there's some additional IP that Pfizer's filed on mRNA, but a lot of the mRNA IP is kind of shared and licensed. The know-how for manufacturing it, that could be taught and trained, but it takes time, and you got to find a facility that's capable of production. And if you don't have one, you got to build it out. And the final thing I'll say on this is that it's very inefficient. I mean, even the fill finishing, even what Pfizer's going to do at that South African facility, it's going to be a lot more expensive than what Pfizer is doing right now, because the way to do this efficiently, the mRNA production in particular, is to do it at massive scale. That's why Pfizer's manufacturing all 4 billion doses and probably more than that at 2 facilities, one in Michigan, one in Belgium. They have other facilities doing other components of the manufacturing process, but the final stages are being done in consolidated facilities, because to do it efficiently and to control the process, you want to do it at scale. And that's also why, and I'll pause here, it's also why, if you look at biologics, you look at any biological drug, take Eylea, take Herceptin, typically they're manufactured at a single site, because you don't want to operate multiple sites to manufacture, because the characteristics of the drug is so closely tied to how it's manufactured that to maintain control over the characteristics of the drug, you have to maintain control over how it's manufactured. The best way to maintain control over how it's manufactured is manufacture it at a single site. So the same thing is kind of operative here. So this idea that, well, we should just be, transferring the tech and letting everyone do this, I'm not actually sure what that means. I think it means going in and training existing facilities on how to make these vaccines, and you can do that. And J&J did that with Merck, but it's not something that's going to happen quickly. And chances are, if you really want to be able to do it at any scale, you're going to have to actually build out a facility, because the facilities for making mRNA vaccines, they just don't exist. It's not like small molecule drugs where you have facilities all around the world capable of doing it. Pfizer invested like billions and billions of dollars, multiple billions of dollars to build out that facility in Michigan. We have custom machines for the mixing, the final stage made that we have to have custom made that we just can't get enough of. I mean, they're just on back order constantly. They cost about $200 million each to build, and we just keep ordering more of them. So it's hard to do this on a small scale, and it's hard to get it going at scale.
So you said the WHO is playing politics by blaming the drug companies for not making more vaccine available, when the problem, you say, is going to be on the ground, actually making this happen. When the Ebola crisis was happening in West Africa, the US government sent troops there, I think, to try to help with the response. Could we do that now? Should we be doing that now? Or is it just too big a problem because it's all over the world and not just...
No, I don't think it's too big of a problem. I think we should be doing it. And again, the WHO just keeps talking about the supply issues, and eventually the supply issues, and I don't know if it's politics or what, but eventually the supply issues, there's going to be supply available. And then we're going to look at, well, what's the distribution situation? You're starting to see people, you saw that stat article about COVAX recently. We haven't put in place the infrastructure to do this. And you're right. It's like, this is all over the world. There's a lot of austere settings that don't have proper infrastructure, but there's some that are in more desperate need of help than others. And you can start focusing on places in the world that are more at risk from COVID. There's different colder climates, more densely populated places. I mean, there's places that are more at risk from a respiratory pathogen than other places. So you start focusing on the places that are more at risk, have a more vulnerable population and less existing infrastructure. And this is absolutely something that USAID could be doing. I mean, the US could be putting a lot of resources into a global effort to actually stand up distribution systems around the world for these vaccines. And, the mRNA vaccines in particular aren't, I think they can be distributed globally, but the supply chain is a little bit more difficult because of the cold storage than like the J&J vaccine or the AstraZeneca vaccine. So especially if you want to put the mRNA vaccines into some of these markets, you've got to have better infrastructure. So this is something we should be focusing on, and all the dialogue is around, the supply issues. And I'm not saying that we aren't supply constrained right now. If we want to immediately vaccinate everyone. But if we had enough supply to immediately vaccinate everyone, I don't know that we'd be able to do it because we haven't invested enough in the infrastructure to do it. And going forward, the supply issues are not going to be the paramount problem. It's going to be the distribution. And I don't see a commensurate effort to try to focus on the distribution right now. All I see is, discussion, dialogue, and browbeating about what the Western manufacturers aren't doing, as if they took immediate action to start transferring technology to, let's say, Indian manufacturers, because probably the Indian manufacturers are the most advanced to be able to scale this up quickly, that's going to immediately fill the supply problems. I mean, remember the Serum Institute was supposed to make 4 billion doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, and that's arguably an easier vaccine to manufacture in existing facilities. Where's that? I don't see 4 billion doses coming out of the Serum Institute right now in India. So it's not so easy to transfer this technology to facilities and get immediate production. Probably the quickest way to get more immediate production is to scale the existing facilities, but that doesn't go over real well when you talk about it.
Well, I have a million more questions for you, but I did want to make sure I asked you, because of this audience of business journalists here on this conference, what has been your perspective of the coverage you've seen throughout the pandemic? What has this community of journalists done well, and what could we be doing better, do you think?
I think the journalistic coverage has been fantastic during the whole pandemic. It's some of the stuff you see on social media where you have voices that have been able to break through with a lot of misinformation that I think has, corroded the environment to some degree and confused consumers and left them with misimpressions about things like, things they can do to try to protect themselves and their families and keep themselves safe. But the journalistic coverage, you look at some of the journalists who've been engaged in this, and I obviously look more at the science journalists than the business coverage, but the business coverage too, I think has been fantastic. You look at the articles coming out of the Atlantic and, Helen Branswell at Stat, and just really, deeply reported, good analytical pieces written in a way that I think is very obtainable, approachable for consumers. So I think the journalistic profession really shined through this crisis.
Oh, shucks. Well, I see Kathleen is back with us. Kathleen, do I turn it back over to you now?
You do. Thank you so much, Dr. Gottlieb and Meg Tirrell on behalf of CEBU. What a great discussion. We look forward to possibly hearing a new FDA Commissioner appointment today. We'll see.
Maybe. I don't know if it's today. All I know is President Biden's speaking later today. It's presumably on COVID, but I don't know.
Fingers crossed. And I'd like to thank the Commonwealth Fund for not only supporting this program, but CEBU's larger healthcare reporting project. Next up at 10 o'clock is Fostering Diverse and Inclusive Newsrooms. So we'll see you there. Thanks again.